Hey historians, it's Mrs. Lancet. We're going to do notes 2 today, the rise of big business and industry. Find pages 6 and 7 in your packet, the Unit 4 packet that we just started this week. And let's get started. So by the 1860s, about the time of the Civil War, machines had taken over much of the work once done by hand. We kind of talked about that already in our Unit 2. Work was moving from homes into factories, and after the Civil War, new inventions and improved technology made that even more so and brought a lot of growth in business. Many new inventions and manufacturing methods would change the future and impact how goods would be made. So in your notes, under important vocabulary, let's go ahead and write industrialization. This is a review word for us. It means the economic shift from making goods by hand to using machines in factories to manufacture products. In the US and in England, inventors were working on improving, let's get that started. There we go. On improving the process to make steel. Steel is lighter weight but stronger than iron, so it was a desirable product to use in manufacturing. The result, the solution to this problem was called the Bessemer process. It used less coal to heat it up and then increase the production of steel to 500 times what it had been. So this process, this newly discovered cheaper, faster process of making steel a better product than iron ushered in a whole bunch of new inventions. Plows, railroad track, building beams, wire, nails, and even needles were being made out of steel. So there's Henry Bessemer, the man who came up with that invention. The electric power industry grew during the late 1800s. Thomas Edison found the most ways to use electricity. He opened a laboratory called Menlo Park in New Jersey and hired assistants to work in research teams. His lab invented so many things, Edison received more than 1,000 US patents. But now keep in mind, a lot of those patents were ideas that from people who were working under him, and some of those people were African American. His most famous invention was the practical electric light bulb. He figured out how to make a safe light bulb that burned steadily to work in homes and businesses. He also invented the electric grid to safely deliver electric currents to buildings and to homes. So under your very important people, again, we're on page 6. Find Thomas Edison. He made the electric light bulb and turned electricity into an everyday source of power. Guys, this transformed industry because before it was very hard to do work by candlelight, so businesses would have to shut down when the sun went down, but now you can work around the clock really if you want to. And also people were able to, electricity was distributed a lot more easily. Not quite in people's homes yet, but it's starting. Now, I did mention that there were African Americans working under Edison, and this is maybe the most famous one. His name is Lewis Latimer. Notice he was born during the time of slavery, lived a long, healthy life, but one of his greatest inventions was the carbon filament. This is a vital component of the light bulb that Edison is given credit for. And Latimer also helped to draft the patent for Alexander Graham Bell's design of the telephone, and we'll talk about him in a minute. So props to Lewis Latimer. On page 7, you've got a list of inventions. You can see the light bulb there, and we have Thomas Edison listed as the inventor. His invention factory, we call it, Menlo Park in New Jersey, helped to turn electricity into an everyday source of power for homes and businesses. So electricity began replacing water wheels in factories, right? So now we can build factories not right next to a source of fast-moving water. It also helped to power streetcars, which carried passengers around cities. Communication was revolutionized with the telegraph in 1835. We talked about that and how Abraham Lincoln really utilized the telegraph during the Civil War. In 1876, it would once again be made more efficient by this gentleman that you see here, Alexander Graham Bell, who had taught deaf students and wanted a device to transmit human speech into or like using electricity. So one night, Bell was tinkering with this transmitter in his lab, and he spilled acid on himself. He called for help from his assistant, Watson, who was in the other room with the receiver, and Watson heard Bell's voice through the receiver, and the telephone was born. So we can thank Alexander Graham Bell for the invention of the telephone, which made long-distance communication much faster and easier, because we know with the telegraph, you have to learn how to do the Morse code. With the telephone, you can just talk right into it. So again, on page 7, find Alexander Graham Bell's telephone. And don't forget to do your highlighting. It made American industry more efficient and competitive by allowing factories, stores, and customers to communicate quickly and easily. So definitely had an impact on industry. All right. The man you see in the lower right-hand corner is Henry Ford. You probably recognize the name Ford. Ford trucks, very popular. He utilized the assembly line to mass produce his Model T cars. He created a moving assembly line using a conveyor to bring parts to the workers. So instead of having one person build a whole car from the bottom up, what he did is he had one person in charge of one thing, whether it was putting in a bolt or attaching the headlamp or putting in the steering wheel. They just did it over and over and over again. The cars rotated around the factory, coming to the workers, who each one of them had a specific job to do. And this is what is known as mass production. Mass production methods like the assembly line made it possible for workers to make more goods in less time at lower costs. All of those are things that the customer can appreciate, because they can get more goods, they can get them faster, and they can get them at a better price. So since it costs less for Ford to manufacture his Model T, his car attracted more customers. Mass production made goods more affordable, and more people could buy manufactured goods. So the assembly line, which is what I was describing to you guys, is a method of mass production, making lots and lots of things quickly. So you make products faster and you make them less expensive by moving the parts to the workers. And as a result of his invention of mass production, the assembly line, making lots of things quickly, and you can see in the video kind of how it works. Each person stays in place and the product comes to them. I think they're working on engines there. Now, Henry Ford created this assembly line method for his use in his automobile plants. And so he was able to put out cars at a much cheaper price. This changed how people travel when he made his Model T. He also changed the way products were manufactured. So Henry Ford had a big impact on industry. Brothers Orville and Wilbur Wright were bicycle mechanics, fascinated with the idea of building a flying machine. In 1903, the brothers took their gasoline-powered airplane to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. On December 17th, Orville made the first successful flight of a powered aircraft. Didn't go very far, but it did work. By 1918, so just 15 years later, they had made so many improvements on their first invention that the U.S. Postal Service was using air transportation to make it faster and easier to get goods. So just in 15 years, it's just incredible. All right, I'm sorry that that's covered there. I don't think I can move it right now. Let's see. So the first word is flying, and then machine in 1903. That's the one that's being covered up. Sparking industries based on air travel. So 1903 is the one you can't see. Okay, so on page 7, airplanes. The Wright brothers sparked a worldwide interest in flying by the late 1920s. So like about 2 decades after their first flight, the U.S. Postal Service used planes to transport mail, and the military began using planes for scouting and later even fighting. So we'll see them used a little bit in World War II, but not so much for fighting, more for scouting. And then for sure in World War I, and then later on in World War II, they'll be used for fighting. All right, when it comes to big business, monopoly, and that's actually what the game is named after, is a company that controls the making and the sales of a product by eliminating the competition. And so that's how you win the game of Monopoly, right? You get your competition to be so poor that your opponent can't stay in the game anymore. And that's exactly what big businessmen were trying to do in the late 1800s, is take over the entire industry, whatever industry it happened to be. Now, this is illegal, but the government's job is still to continue to look for that. And that is a regulation of business, which didn't exist in the late 1800s. Andrew Carnegie was one of those big businessmen who had a bit of a monopoly. He was originally from Scotland. He moved here when he was 12 and settled in Pennsylvania, working in textile mills at first, where he just really paid attention and learned about running a big business, especially when he was an assistant to a railroad superintendent. The railroads were very big during this time period. When Carnegie started his steel company, he sought to control every part of the process. So he bought iron ore mines. He also bought the ships and the railroads to ship that iron ore and the finished product. He bought the mills that produced his steel and eventually created a whole monopoly in the steel industry. And steel was a huge product during this time. So Carnegie was very, very wealthy. So he becomes a leader of the steel industry by controlling every step of the process. You can see him thinking about all of those various parts in that thought bubble. Rockefeller, another big businessman during this time, he learned to be frugal with money growing up in a poor family, avoiding unnecessary spending. He invested in his first oil refinery in 1862 when he was just 23 years old. And at that time, oil was used to do all kinds of things, from lighting homes and providing energy. And like Carnegie, Rockefeller took control of every step of his business. He bought oil fields, railroads, ships, pipelines, you name it, to help manage the distribution of oil in our country. He combined all of those businesses and he named it the Standard Oil Trust. And he was basically able to wipe out all other people who were trying to work in the oil industry. Whether it was tapping it from the earth or refining it or just, distributing it and selling it, he controlled it all. So another very wealthy man in the late 1800s who had a monopoly in the oil industry. Now this time period, the end of the 1800s, is known as the Gilded Age, and Rockefeller and Carnegie have these wonderful rags to riches story. Both of them born poor, and then grew into a life of just crazy wealth. Their success inspired many to try and achieve what has become known as the American dream through really hard work. However, these stories hid an important reality. Most people who were millionaires in this era didn't start out poor. While the number of millionaires increased during this era, the reality was that most people who worked for their companies in the factories were living in extreme poverty. So you guys can see John D. Rockefeller's living room there versus the poor immigrant living conditions in the cities where the factories were located. Definitely not an equal comparison. We'll talk more about that this week. And we have this urbanization is our last term for important vocabulary, which is that large numbers of people left farming to find jobs in factories, which caused a large growth in the cities. So you can see the word urban right in there. So a huge attraction to the cities at this time. All right, so that helped the growth of industries and increase in factories. Manufacturing created millions of jobs in urban cities. People flooded into those cities, New technologies were used to build them. Electricity and steel changed the structure of the cities. Elevators allowed for cities to grow upward. And tenement buildings housed as many families as it could hold when housing became scarce. There's a famous picture from this time period. All right, so when it comes to industrialization, we've got the positives and the negatives, right? We've been talking about this idea all week. With progress comes cost. So on the positive side, we have more jobs, and that is jobs for Americans who are moving from the rural areas, but it also attracts many, many immigrants to the United States, which we will talk about next. Making products quicker and cheaper means that more Americans have access to more products. They can afford them, and they're coming out faster. The prices of those products become more affordable. So again, more Americans have more access to the products that the country is producing. New inventions are making life easier. A lot of you brought that up in our bell ringer earlier this week, that inventions make life easier. Like, for example, the washing machine was developed during this time, and the vacuum cleaner, and of course the light bulb, which makes life at night so much easier. And the businessmen like Carnegie and Rockefeller gained great, great wealth. Now, some of the negatives. Factory jobs brought more people to already crowded cities, and so the people who ran those cities were overwhelmed and trying to take care of those people in terms of fresh water and garbage removal and so forth. Places to live. Most immigrant workers lived in what are known as tenements. These are very quickly built, I can't even call them apartment buildings, they're just rooms with very little amenities, very little in the way of fresh air or like water, for example. So just horrible conditions. Tenement apartments were also often very overcrowded because of the sheer number of people that were coming into the cities to get work at those factories. Natural resources were being destroyed because of our use of coal and the logging industry, and then lots of pollution as well. And monopolies were forming. These were a way to get rid of all competition, which sounds good if you're on the winning end of that, but if you're at all trying to become, to get into a business that is being monopolized by a big company already, you probably don't have much of a chance, and that doesn't do much for competition, which is what our country's economy is based on. All right, I'm gonna be done and just remind you that we will continue to come back to this idea of progress versus cost. Have a great day.